Hello, my friends, and welcome to Immersive History. When you hear the word Viking, what image comes to mind? Perhaps a towering warrior with horned helmet and massive axe, sailing across stormy seas in a dragon-headed longship to pillage defenseless monasteries. We imagine bloodthirsty berserkers howling as they charge into battle. Or perhaps noble explorers discovering new worlds with nothing but courage and a sense of adventure. But the real life of a Norseman during the Viking Age, from roughly 793 to 1066 AD, was far more complex than these popular images suggest. It began as a world driven by harsh practical concerns: overpopulation, limited farmland, political instability, and the desperate need for survival. But as early successes revealed the wealth and vulnerability of foreign lands, these survival raids transformed into something more ambitious: calculated expeditions for profit, land, and power. What started as necessity quickly became opportunity. Tonight we will step into the leather boots of an ordinary Norse farmer and follow the journey that might lead you from your small plot of rocky soil in Norway to the green shores of England, or perhaps to the vast rivers of Russia, or even to the mysterious lands beyond the Western Ocean. We'll discover the sophisticated technology that made these journeys possible, the complex social structures that governed Viking society, and the harsh realities of both raiding and settlement that shaped medieval Europe. Before we dive into the Viking Age, I'd appreciate it if you gave this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Doing so makes this historical journey possible, and it's truly appreciated. Now, let the present fade away as we set sail for a world of carved dragon heads, sharp steel, and endless horizons. Our story doesn't begin with a raid or a battle. It begins with you, a humble villager trying to survive in Scandinavia. You are not a hero from the sagas, not a legendary king. You are simply a farmer, perhaps 25 years old, standing on a small patch of cleared land that your family has worked for generations. But this land, scraped from the forest in what will one day be called Norway, is barely enough to sustain you, your wife, and your 2 young children. The growing season here is short and brutal. The soil is thin and rocky, grudgingly yielding small harvests of barley and oats, even in good years. The winters are long, dark months, when the sun barely climbs above the horizon, and your family huddles around a central fire pit in your one-room longhouse, carefully rationing the grain and preserved meat that must last until spring. You have seen too many of these winters end in hunger, watched neighbours' children grow thin and hollow-eyed as the food stores dwindle. This is the reality that drives the Viking Age, not wanderlust but desperation. Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th centuries was experiencing a population boom. Families were larger, people were living longer, but the amount of good farmland remained the same. Your older brother inherited your father's farm, as tradition dictates. Your younger brother joined a local chieftain's warband. But you, caught in the middle, must make your own way in a world where opportunities are scarce. You have 3 basic choices. You can stay and try to scratch out a living from the marginal land still available, knowing that each winter brings the risk of starvation. You can travel south to serve as a mercenary in the armies of the Frankish kingdoms, trading your sword arm for silver, but likely never seeing home again. Or you can join a ship crew heading west across the Whale Road, the sea that stretches beyond the horizon toward lands rumoured to hold wealth beyond imagination. The choice, you realise, is not really a choice at all. Like thousands of other young Norsemen in your position, you choose the sea. But this decision requires more than just courage. It requires connections, resources, and timing. Viking expeditions were not random acts of violence launched by desperate individuals. They were carefully planned business ventures, organised by wealthy chieftains and kings who could afford to build ships, gather crews, and provision expeditions that might last for months. Picture this: you're living at the very beginning of what will become the greatest expansion your people have ever known. Your father still remembers the stories that swept through every Norse settlement like wildfire, tales of the great raid on Lindisfarne, when ships from these very fjords appeared like sea wolves off the English coast. Changed everything overnight, he tells you, his eyes distant with memory. Suddenly every young man with a sword was dreaming of Christian gold. The monks had never seen Viking steel before, their treasures just sitting there, waiting for the taking. That single raid opened floodgates across the Norse world. Every summer since, more and more chieftains have been launching their own expeditions, each trying to outdo the last. Your neighbour returned from Ireland with hack silver weighing down his arms, speaking of monasteries, so wealthy they use gold to decorate their books. Traders passing through your settlement tell of Danish jarls who've started spending entire winters in England, no longer content with quick summer raids. Some say there are Norse warriors pushing eastward too, following rivers deep into lands where no Norseman has ever set foot. This is the moment. You can feel it in your bones. The old pressures that drove your people to sea haven't disappeared. The rocky soil still yields thin harvests. Younger sons still inherit nothing. And jarls still fight over every scrap of good land. But now there's something new mixed with that desperation. Opportunity. Every successful raid proves that survival doesn't have to mean scratching out a living from these harsh fjords. Every ship that returns brings tales of lands where the soil is black and rich, where monasteries hoard more silver than your entire village sees in a lifetime, where a man with courage and a sharp sword can carve out something better than his father ever dreamed possible. You approach Jarl Eric, a local lord who owns 3 longships and has led successful raids to the wealthy monasteries of Ireland and northern England. His hall is larger than your entire farm, built of thick oak logs and decorated with shields and weapons, taken as plunder from previous expeditions. The great hearth in the centre blazes with a fire that never dies, and the walls are hung with tapestries depicting scenes from the great stories, Odin hanging from Yggdrasil, Thor battling the Midgard serpent, Ragnar Lothbrok's death in the snake pit. Jarl Eric looks you over carefully. He needs men for his next expedition, but not just any men. A ship's crew is a close-knit band that must work together under the most dangerous conditions. He asks about your skills. Can you handle an oar in rough seas? Do you know how to maintain weapons and armour? Have you ever fought with sword and shield? Most importantly, do you have anything to contribute to the expedition's success? This last question is crucial. Viking expeditions operated on a profit-sharing basis. Everyone from the ship's captain to the newest crew member had a stake in the venture's success. Also, Vikings were expected to contribute to the initial investment. You offer your father's old sword, a decent blade passed down through 3 generations, and your skills as a woodworker. The ship will need constant repairs during a long voyage, and someone who can shape new oars or patch holes in the hull is invaluable. Jarl Eric nods his approval. You are accepted into his ship's crew. The die is cast. You will become what future generations will call a Viking, though the word itself simply means one who goes raiding. To your family and neighbours, you are still the farmer, but you are about to embark on a journey that will transform you and unknowingly help reshape the medieval world. The preparations for a Viking expedition reveal the sophisticated planning behind what many imagine to be simple piracy. In the weeks before departure, you help prepare not just one ship, but a small fleet that will travel together for mutual protection and support. Each ship represents a massive investment. A single longship might take a year to build and could cost as much as several farms, but you've witnessed firsthand just how complex this investment really is. You remember watching the master shipwright, Ulf Ironbeard, as he personally selected each piece of timber. He would run his weathered hands along the grain of oak planks, muttering ancient words your grandfather taught him about wood that speaks to the sea. The keel, that crucial backbone of the ship, had to be carved from a single, enormous oak that took 6 men 2 days just to fell. Finding the right tree meant searching through entire forests, looking for timber that grew straight and true, without knots that could split under the immense stress of ocean swells. You've seen grown warriors argue like children over the curve of a single strake, those overlapping planks that give the longship its distinctive flexibility. Get the angle wrong by even a finger's width, and the ship will fight the waves instead of dancing with them. The iron rivets alone represent more metal than most farmers see in a lifetime, each one hand-forged by blacksmiths who understand that the ship's life depends on fastenings that won't corrode in salt spray. Between the planks, they stuff a mixture of tarred rope and sheep's wool, sealed with pine resin that must be applied in exactly the right weather. Too wet and it won't stick, too dry and it cracks before the ship even touches water. The most unnerving part is watching these craftsmen work almost by instinct, their hands knowing secrets their minds struggle to explain. They'll reject perfectly good-looking timber because something in its weight feels wrong, or spend hours adjusting a joint that looks identical to your untrained eye. The ships themselves are marvels of engineering that will not be surpassed for centuries. Your vessel, which the crew has named Seawolf, is approximately 70 feet long, but only 18 feet wide, with a shallow draft that allows it to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. The hull is built using a technique called clinker construction, with overlapping planks that make the ship both flexible and strong. This flexibility is crucial. In rough seas, a rigid ship would break apart, but a Viking longship bends with the waves like a living thing. The most remarkable feature is the ship's dual nature. A single mast supports a large square sail made of wool, often striped in bright colours that can catch even the slightest breeze. But when the wind fails, or when navigating narrow rivers, the mast can be lowered and the crew can power the ship with oars. 32 oarsmen, 16 on each side, can drive the ship through calm waters at a steady pace that can be maintained for hours. You quickly learn that the ship's cargo capacity is limited and every item must justify its space. The crew brings weapons, of course, swords, axes, spears, and round wooden shields covered in leather and reinforced with iron. But equally important are the tools of survival and trade. Axes for cutting wood, fishing nets and hooks, cooking pots, and small anvils for maintaining weapons and tools. Each man brings his own sea bag containing a wool cloak, an extra tunic, and personal items like dice, combs carved from bone, and small silver arm rings that serve as portable currency. Food for a voyage lasting several weeks must be carefully calculated. The crew brings barrels of water and sour milk, sacks of dried meat and fish, hard cheese that will keep for months, and flatbread that stays edible far longer than regular bread. Most importantly, there are barrels of ale. Like sailors everywhere, Vikings knew that alcohol was safer to drink than water, that might become contaminated during a long voyage. The departure itself is timed to coincide with favourable winds and political conditions. Spring and summer are the traditional raiding seasons, when the weather is most predictable and the seas are less dangerous. But equally important is intelligence about conditions in the target areas. Merchants, previous raiders, and even slaves taken in earlier expeditions provide information about which monasteries have recently received valuable donations, which towns have weak defences, and which local rulers are distracted by wars or internal conflicts. On a grey morning in late April, with the wind blowing steadily from the east, your expedition finally departs. You help push Seawolf from the beach into the shallow water, then scramble aboard as Jarl Eric takes his position at the steering oar. The sail is raised, and the ships of your small fleet begin their journey west across the North Sea toward the coast of England. As the familiar hills of your homeland disappear behind you, replaced by the endless grey-green of the open ocean, you realise there is no turning back. You are now part of a tradition that has been growing for generations, a movement of people that will be remembered long after the last Viking ship has rotted away. You are about to experience firsthand what it really meant to be a Viking. The reality of life aboard a Viking longship quickly dispels any romantic notions about seafaring adventure. The ship that seemed so large and impressive on land now feels cramped and precarious as it rises and falls. With the ocean swells, 32 crew members, plus equipment and supplies, are packed into a space roughly the size of a large modern house. There is no privacy, no escape from the constant company of your shipmates. Your first lesson is in the basic seamanship that keeps the ship moving and the crew alive. When the wind is favourable, the sail does most of the work, and the crew can rest, repair equipment, or simply endure the monotonous hours as the ship cuts through the waves. But when the wind dies or shifts to blow against your direction of travel, every able-bodied man takes his place at the oars. The crew members speak in hushed tones about legendary ship handlers whose names have become synonymous with mastery of the seas. They tell you about Ragnar Lothbrok himself, who sailed his fleet up the Seine to attack Paris itself. That man, whispers Thorvald the Scarred, adjusting his grip on his oar, could read wind patterns like runes carved in stone. His ships moved like hunting wolves, silent, swift, appearing where enemies least expected them. But even more impressive to the crew is Halfdan the Black, the Norwegian king, whose fleets have been terrorising the coasts of Scotland and Ireland with surgical precision. The stories say he can navigate in fog so thick you can't see your own feet, using nothing but the smell of land and the sound of waves against different types of shoreline. A ship under Halfdan's command, the men say, moves like it has eyes and a mind of its own. He can find safe harbour in storms that would destroy lesser captains. These aren't just tales to pass time, they're lessons. Every successful raid depends on seamanship that can get you to your target undetected, strike fast, and escape before enemy reinforcements arrive. Rowing a Viking longship is an art that requires not just strength but coordination and endurance. The oars are long and heavy, and the stroke must be perfectly timed with your oarmate across the ship and the 15 other pairs of rowers. The rhythm is set by the ship's poet, who chants working songs that help coordinate the effort and maintain morale. Hour after hour, you pull your oar through the cold water, your hands developing blisters that break and bleed, then harden into calluses. The weather is your constant enemy. Even in summer, the North Sea is cold and unpredictable. Sudden storms can arise with little warning, turning the sea into a chaos of wind and wave that threatens to swamp the ship or drive it onto hidden rocks. When storms hit, every piece of equipment must be secured. The sail must be furled, and the crew must bail water with leather buckets while fighting to keep the ship pointed into the waves. But perhaps the greatest challenge is simply enduring the voyage. There are no comfortable berths, no shelter from wind and spray. At night, if weather permits, the ship might be pulled up onto a beach where the crew can light a fire, cook a hot meal, and sleep on solid ground. But more often, you sleep where you sit, wrapped in a wool cloak and oil-treated leather, trying to stay warm and dry in the bottom of an open boat. The food becomes monotonous quickly. Dried fish and meat, hard cheese and flatbread make up most meals, washed down with ale or sour milk. Fresh water is precious and must be carefully rationed. On longer voyages, scurvy becomes a real threat, though the Vikings didn't understand the cause. They knew only that men sometimes became weak and sick, their teeth loosened, and old wounds reopened. Yet despite these hardships, there is something undeniably magnificent about the experience. Standing in the bow of Seawolf as it cuts through the waves, spray flying from the dragon-headed prow, you feel a sense of freedom and power unknown to those who never leave their small farms and villages. This is the legendary Whale Road, the sea highway that connects all the known world and leads to lands beyond the horizon. After 4 days of sailing, a cry goes up from the lookout, land ahead. Through the morning mist, you can make out the green coast of Northumbria, the northern kingdom of England. But this is not yet your destination. Jarl Erik has chosen a more ambitious target, the wealthy monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, the same holy island that was attacked in 793 AD in one of the first recorded Viking raids. As your fleet approaches the coast, the careful planning behind Viking raids becomes apparent. This is not a random attack by savage barbarians, but a precisely targeted strike designed for maximum profit with minimum risk. Monasteries were ideal targets, not because Vikings were anti-Christian, but because they were undefended repositories of wealth. In an age when most people lived in poverty, monasteries accumulated gold and silver ornaments, precious manuscripts decorated with gold leaf, fine textiles, and most importantly, they often held treasure, donated by wealthy nobles seeking to buy their way into heaven. Lindisfarne is particularly attractive because it sits on an island connected to the mainland only at low tide. This isolation, which normally provides security, now becomes a trap. Once the raiders land, the monks have nowhere to flee, the monastery's wealth cannot be hidden or moved quickly, and the nearest military force is miles away on the mainland. Your ships approach the island in the pre-dawn darkness, their dragon heads cutting silently through the calm water. The attack is planned to coincide with the morning prayers, when the monks will be gathered in the chapel and least likely to notice the approaching danger. As the ships grind against the pebbly beach, you experience a moment of crystalline clarity. Everything you have been told about Viking raids, everything you thought you knew about your own people's reputation, is about to be tested against reality. Jarl Erik gives quick, quiet orders. Crew is divided into 3 groups. One group stays with the ships, ready to push off quickly if escape becomes necessary. A second group spreads out to secure the perimeter of the monastery and watch for approaching help from the mainland. The third group, including you, will enter the monastery itself to gather the plunder. As you check your weapons one final time, sword at your belt, wooden shield on your arm, iron-tipped spear in your hand, you realize that you're about to cross a line that can never be uncrossed. In a few minutes, you will no longer be the farmer. You will become the raider, one of the feared Northmen, whose very name will make peaceful people bar their doors and pray for protection. The monastery of Lindisfarne is not a fortress, but a collection of simple stone and wooden buildings surrounding a central church. The monks here live simple lives devoted to prayer, scholarship, and copying manuscripts. They have no weapons, no military training, and no expectation that anyone would attack a holy place. As your group approaches the chapel, you can hear the sound of morning prayers drifting through the thin walls. What happens next defines both the reality and the reputation of Viking raiders. Contrary to popular imagination, this is not a scene of mindless slaughter. Jarl Erik's orders are clear. Take the treasure, capture anyone who might be valuable as a slave, but avoid unnecessary killing. Dead monks produce no ransom, and excessive violence might prompt the English kings to organise more effective defences against future raids. The chapel doors are pushed open, and your group enters to find about 20 monks kneeling in prayer before a golden altar cross. Their faces turn pale with terror as they see armed men silhouetted in the doorway. Some cry out in Latin, others in the local English dialect, but all recognise what you represent, their worst nightmare made real. The raid itself is swift and efficient. While some of your companions search the monastery's buildings for hidden treasure, you help gather the most obvious valuables from the chapel. The golden altar cross is carefully pried from its mounting. Silver chalices, ornate religious books with jewelled covers, silk vestments embroidered with gold thread, all are gathered into leather sacks. The monastery's storerooms yield other prizes: wheels of cheese, barrels of ale, and sacks of grain that will help feed your crew on the return journey. Several of the younger monks are selected as captives. In the medieval world, slavery is still a common institution, and healthy young men can be sold in the slave markets of Dublin, York, or even as far away as Constantinople. The older monks are generally left unharmed but terrified, which serves Jarl Eric's purposes perfectly. They will spread word of the attack, ensuring that the reputation of his crew grows, and that future targets might be more willing to surrender quickly rather than face similar treatment. The entire raid lasts less than 2 hours. As the sun climbs higher in the morning sky, your ships push off from Lindisfarne, carrying treasure that represents several years' income for your entire village back in Norway. More importantly, you have gained something equally valuable: a reputation. Word of this successful attack will spread throughout the Norse settlements, enhancing Jarl Eric's ability to recruit crews for future expeditions. As Seawolf sails away from the English coast, you have time to reflect on what you've just experienced. The raid was simultaneously more and less than you expected. More, because the efficiency and careful planning revealed a level of sophistication that you hadn't fully appreciated. Less, because there was no glorious battle, no chance to prove your courage in single combat. The monks offered no resistance, and the whole affair felt more like a very dangerous form of robbery than the heroic warfare celebrated in the old stories. But you are also beginning to understand something that future historians will debate for centuries. Viking raids were not just acts of piracy, but the leading edge of a massive migration and settlement movement. The treasure taken from Lindisfarne is not just personal enrichment for the crew. It represents capital that can be invested in more ships, larger expeditions, and eventually permanent settlements in the lands across the sea. This first successful raid marks the beginning of your transformation from farmer to Viking, but it is only the beginning. Over the next several years, you will participate in dozens of such expeditions, each one teaching you more about seamanship, warfare, and the complex political landscape of early medieval Europe. You will discover that being a Viking involves far more than raiding. It means becoming part of a network of trade, diplomacy, and settlement that stretches from Greenland to Constantinople. The success of the Lindisfarne raid opens new possibilities that extend far beyond simple piracy. As Seawolf and her sister ships return to Norway, loaded with treasure and slaves, Jarl Eric is already planning more ambitious expeditions. But you also learn that successful Viking leaders must be far more than simple raiders. They must be diplomats, traders, and strategists who can navigate the complex political landscape of 9th century Europe. The grizzled veterans around the fire tell you stories that illustrate this perfectly. They speak of Godfred, the Danish king, whose shadow still looms over every Norse expedition. "That man," says one of veterans, spitting into the flames, "knew that silver talks louder than steel. Godfred had mastered something your generation is only beginning to understand: how to play Christian kings against each other like pieces on a board game." When Charlemagne's empire was strong, Godfred would offer to patrol the waters against other Norse raiders. For a price, of course. When Charlemagne died and his sons began fighting over the inheritance, Godfred switched sides, selling his services to whichever Frankish prince offered the most silver. The stories describe how he could walk into a Christian court wearing silk instead of mail, speaking their Latin better than some of their own priests, negotiating tributary payments that made him richer than raiding ever could. But the moment these same Christian rulers showed weakness, his longships would appear on their coasts like hungry wolves. He'd take their silver as payment for peace one season, the veteran explains, drawing patterns in the dirt with his knife, then take their gold as spoils of war the next. They never knew which Godfred they were dealing with, the civilized king or the sea wolf. This wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. Godfred proved that a Norse leader could extract wealth from Christian lands without the risks and losses of constant warfare, while keeping his fleets ready to strike whenever diplomacy failed. Now, watching Jarl Eric distribute the Lindisfarne treasure, you see Godfred's lessons being applied. This isn't just about celebrating a successful raid, it's about investing in future power. Some of the silver taken from Lindisfarne will be used to purchase better weapons and armour. Some will be given as gifts to other Norse chieftains to secure alliances, and some will be invested in the ships and supplies needed for an even more ambitious venture, establishing a permanent base in the rich lands across the sea. This is how the Viking Age really worked. Raids were not isolated acts of violence, but stepping stones toward larger goals. The same ships that carried raiders to English monasteries also carried merchants to trading centres like York and Dublin. The same warriors who terrified monks also served as mercenaries in the armies of English and Irish kings. And the same leaders who organised raids also negotiated treaties, arranged marriages between noble families, and established the permanent settlements that would become cities like York and Dublin. Your education as a true Viking accelerates rapidly over the following years. You participate in raids along the coast of Ireland, where the monasteries are even richer than those in England. You sail up the rivers of France, navigating hundreds of miles inland to attack towns that have never seen Viking ships. You learn to fight with sword and shield, to maintain your weapons and armour, and to read the signs that indicate changing weather or hidden dangers. More importantly, you learn the social and political skills that separate successful Vikings from mere pirates. In Dublin, you serve as one of Jarl Eric's representatives in negotiating the sale of stolen goods to Irish merchants. In York, you help establish trading relationships with English craftsmen who are eager to exchange their products for amber from the Baltic and furs from the far north. You discover that Vikings are not just raiders, but crucial middlemen in a complex trading network that connects Scandinavia with the rest of Europe. The life is profitable, but dangerous. You see companions die in battles with English and Irish soldiers. Others are lost to storms or disease, but those who survive become wealthy by the standards of their time. And more importantly, they gain the resources needed to establish themselves permanently in the rich lands they have been raiding. By your 5th year as a member of Jarl Eric's crew, the nature of your expeditions has changed dramatically. Instead of quick raids followed by immediate returns to Norway, you are now part of longer expeditions aimed at establishing permanent bases. Jarl Eric has allied himself with other Norse leaders to create what the English call the Great Army, a confederation of Viking forces large enough to conquer and hold territory, rather than simply raid and retreat. This great army captures York in 866 AD and establishes it as the capital of a new Viking kingdom in northern England. The stories about York still give you chills. These stories speak of that day when the great army captured what the English called Eoforwich, but the Vikings renamed Jorvik. The city fell not through heroic siege, but because of English stupidity and Viking patience, old Ragnar the Lame tells you, his scarred face animated by firelight. The Northumbrian kings, Osbert and Ella, had been too busy fighting each other to notice the great army gathering strength. When they finally tried to unite against the Vikings, it was far too late. I was just a boy then, Ragnar continues, but I remember watching from the ships as their pathetic forces approached the city, already exhausted and bickering over leadership. The siege lasted barely a day. While the English attacked the main gate, Ivar, the Boneless, led a smaller force through a breach in the Roman walls that the English had never bothered to repair. The screams, Ragnar whispers. You could hear them even from the river. And King Ella's death, thrown into a pit of snakes as revenge for Ragnar Lothbrok. But what happened after was more remarkable than the conquest itself. Instead of burning York to ash, the Viking leaders made it their permanent capital. That wasn't just about loot anymore. That was about building something to last generations. These stories inspire your own generation, showing what's possible when Vikings think beyond simple raiding. But this is not a conquest in the traditional sense. The Vikings do not simply drive out the existing population and take their lands. Instead, they create a hybrid society that combines Norse and English elements. Viking warriors marry English women, English craftsmen work for Viking lords. The two cultures begin to merge in ways that will profoundly influence the development of medieval England. You find yourself assigned not to a raiding ship, but to one of the groups responsible for establishing and defending the new settlement. This means learning new skills, not just warfare and seamanship, but agriculture, construction, and administration. The Vikings who settle in England must learn to work with the existing English population, adopting some of their customs while maintaining their own traditions. The traditions you refuse to abandon run deeper than blood. Each morning, you still make the old offerings, a splash of ale on the ground for Thor before beginning any heavy work, a whispered prayer to Odin when making important decisions. The English Christians cross themselves. You touch the hammer pendant at your throat. When disputes arise in the settlement, you insist on resolving them the Norse way, through the Thing, that ancient assembly where free men can speak their minds and vote on matters of law. The English find this strange, accustomed as they are to having lords make decisions for them, but even some of them begin to appreciate a system where a farmer can challenge a jarl's judgment and expect to be heard. Your wedding customs particularly confuse the locals. When your friend marries an Englishwoman, the ceremony blends both traditions, but certain Norse elements remain non-negotiable. The bride must still wear the ancestral crown, a family heirloom passed down through generations, and the groom must present a sword to his bride's family, demonstrating his ability to protect her. The feast lasts 3 days instead of 1, with competitions of strength and skill that would seem barbaric to soft Christian sensibilities. Most importantly, you maintain the tradition of oath swearing, binding yourself to your companions through sacred vows that mean more than any Christian marriage ceremony. These oaths, sworn over weapons blessed by the gods, create bonds that survive even death. Your burial customs remain unchanged as well. When old Viking dies that first winter, you build him a proper ship burial despite English protests. His weapons, his drinking horn, even his favourite hunting hound accompany him to Valhalla. The English burn their dead or bury them in simple wooden boxes, but a Norse warrior deserves to sail into the afterlife as he lived, with honour, wealth, and the tools he'll need in Odin's hall. Your new role as a settler rather than a raider reveals another side of Viking society that is often overlooked: their remarkable adaptability. Vikings were not just warriors, but also cultivators, artisans, traders, and stewards of their communities. They had to be. Successful colonization required not just the ability to conquer territory, but the skills needed to make that territory productive. In York, you help establish new farms outside the city walls, bringing Norse agricultural techniques to English soil. You learn to work with English blacksmiths to produce weapons and tools that combine the best of both traditions. Most importantly, you participate in the complex negotiations and agreements that allow Viking settlers to coexist with the existing English population. This process of settlement and integration occurs throughout the Viking world. In Ireland, Vikings established trading towns like Dublin and Waterford that become crucial links between Scandinavia and the broader European economy. In France, they negotiate with the Frankish king to establish the Duchy of Normandy, which becomes a launching point for further expansion. In Russia, they create the trading routes that connect Scandinavia with Byzantium and the Islamic world. But the most remarkable example of Viking adaptability may be their expansion into the North Atlantic. While some Vikings were establishing kingdoms in England and Ireland, others were pushing west into completely unknown waters, discovering and settling islands that had never seen human habitation. Your own life takes a dramatic turn when Jarl Eric announces his most ambitious expedition yet, a voyage to the newly discovered lands beyond Iceland. Reports have reached York of a Viking named Eric the Red who has been exploring a vast island far to the west, a land he calls Greenland to make it sound more attractive to potential settlers. Eric is organising a colonisation expedition, and he needs experienced Vikings who can help establish permanent settlements in this new world. The prospect both terrifies and excites you. After nearly a decade of raiding and fighting in the familiar waters around Britain and Ireland, the idea of sailing into completely unknown territory represents the ultimate Viking adventure. But it also represents enormous risks. There will be no existing settlements to trade with, no monasteries to raid for quick profit. Success will depend entirely on the colonists' ability to create a self-sufficient society in what Eric admits is a harsh and unforgiving environment. Yet the opportunity is irresistible. In England, the best land is already taken, and the English kingdoms are becoming better organised at defending themselves against Viking raids. Political control is shifting toward the English kings, and many Vikings are beginning to feel like a minority in their own settlements. Greenland represents a chance to start fresh, to create a purely Norse society without the complications of ruling over a conquered population. The expedition to Greenland reveals the Vikings at their most impressive, not as raiders or conquerors, but as explorers and colonists pushing the boundaries of the known world. The voyage itself is far more challenging than anything you experienced during your raiding years. Instead of coastal navigation using familiar landmarks, this expedition requires true ocean, sailing across hundreds of miles of open water. The ships used for this expedition are different from the sleek longships designed for raiding. These are nurs, broader and deeper vessels, designed to carry the livestock, tools and supplies needed to establish a new colony. Your ship carries not just people, but cattle, sheep, horses, and goats, along with the seeds, tools, and raw materials needed to build a settlement from scratch. The voyage takes nearly 2 weeks of sailing through some of the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. You encounter icebergs, sudden storms, and fog so thick that it's impossible to see the other ships in your fleet, even when they're only a few hundred yards away. Navigation depends entirely on the skill of the expedition leaders, who use the sun, stars, and their knowledge of ocean currents and weather patterns to find their way across the trackless sea. When the coast of Greenland finally appears through the morning mist, you understand why Eric chose the name. The shores are indeed green with grass and low shrubs, at least during the brief summer season. But the interior is dominated by a massive ice sheet that extends beyond the horizon. And even the coastal areas will clearly be challenging places to establish farms. The site chosen for the main settlement is a broad fjord on the southwestern coast that Eric has named Eric's Fjord. The location offers several advantages: protection from the worst storms, access to the sea for fishing and communication with Iceland and Norway, and enough grass and shrubland to support livestock. But it also presents enormous challenges that will test every skill you've learned during your years as a Viking. The first year in Greenland pushes you and your fellow colonists to the limits of endurance. Everything must be built from scratch: houses, barns, workshops, and all the infrastructure of a functioning settlement. The work is backbreaking, and there are no shortcuts. Stone must be quarried, timber must be cut and shaped, and fields must be cleared and prepared for planting. The construction techniques required in Greenland differ significantly from those used in milder climates. The houses must be built partially underground to take advantage of the Earth's insulating properties. The walls are thick stone and turf construction that can withstand the fierce Arctic winds. Most importantly, the buildings must be designed to preserve heat during the long winter months when temperatures plummet far below anything experienced in Scandinavia. You learn to work with materials that are scarce and precious in this new environment. Timber is particularly valuable. Large trees are rare in Greenland, so every piece of wood must be carefully planned and used efficiently. Iron is even more precious, since there are no local sources of ore, and every nail, tool, and weapon must be either brought from Iceland or carefully maintained from existing stock. The scarcity of these essential materials forces the colonists to develop innovative solutions that blend Norse traditions with adaptations to Arctic conditions. The livestock brought from Iceland and Norway must be carefully managed to ensure their survival through the long, dark winter. The colonists discover that cattle, which are central to Norse farming culture, are barely viable in Greenland's harsh climate. Sheep and goats prove more adaptable, but even they require constant attention and careful management of feed supplies. The short growing season means that hay cutting becomes an absolutely critical activity that determines whether the animals will survive until spring. Hunting and fishing take on new importance in the Arctic environment. The traditional Norse diet of grain, dairy, and preserved meat must be supplemented with seal, whale, and Arctic char. You learn hunting techniques that have been developed by the Inuit peoples who have lived in these regions for generations. The relationship with these indigenous people is complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, always careful. They possess knowledge essential to survival in the Arctic, but they also represent competition for hunting grounds and resources. The isolation creates psychological challenges that test the colonists in unexpected ways. In Norway, or even in the Viking settlements in Britain, help was never more than a few days' journey away. In Greenland, the nearest European settlement is in Iceland, hundreds of miles across some of the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. Ships can only make the voyage during the brief summer season, and even then, storms or ice can prevent contact for years at a time. This isolation forces the Greenland colonists to develop a level of self-sufficiency unknown in other Viking settlements. Every skill needed for survival must be present within the community, from blacksmithing to medicine to the complex knowledge required for navigation and weather prediction. The loss of a single individual with crucial skills can threaten the entire settlement's survival. But perhaps the greatest challenge is psychological. Unlike the raids and battles of your earlier years, which provided immediate excitement and the possibility of quick wealth, colonization is a slow grinding process that requires years of careful work before it yields results. There are no monasteries to raid, no existing populations to trade with or tax. Success depends entirely on your ability to create wealth through farming, fishing, and careful management of limited resources. The winter months are particularly difficult. During the darkest period, the sun barely rises above the horizon, and the colonists must live by firelight and oil lamps for months at a time. The confined living conditions, the monotonous diet, and the constant struggle to stay warm create tensions that can tear communities apart. The Norwegian saying, "Winter is the test that separates the wheat from the chaff," takes on new meaning in the Arctic environment. Yet as the settlement gradually takes shape, you begin to understand the true achievement of the Viking expansion. Greenland represents the furthest edge of medieval European civilization, a colony established more than 500 years before Columbus reached the Americas. The Vikings who settled here were not just warriors or raiders, but pioneers who pushed human settlement into environments that challenged the limits of medieval technology and social organization. The Greenland settlements developed their own unique culture that combines Norse traditions with adaptations to the Arctic environment. The colonists learned to hunt seals and walruses, skills acquired from the Inuit people they occasionally encounter. They developed new techniques for preserving food and managing livestock in the extreme cold. Most remarkably, they maintained contact with Iceland and Norway through regular trading voyages, exchanging walrus ivory, polar bear pelts, and other Arctic products for the iron tools, grain, and manufactured goods they cannot produce locally. From Greenland, the most adventurous Vikings push even further west, reaching the coast of North America nearly 500 years before any other Europeans. These expeditions to what they call Vinland represent the absolute limit of Viking expansion. the point where even their remarkable adaptability and seamanship reach their limits. But as you grow older in the Greenland colony, you begin to sense that the great age of Viking expansion is coming to an end. The political landscape of Europe is changing in ways that make the old lifestyle of raiding and migration increasingly difficult. The English kingdoms have united under stronger central authority and developed better defences against Viking attacks. The Frankish Empire has fragmented, but the successor kingdoms are also becoming more organised and militaristic. Most importantly, Christianity is spreading throughout Scandinavia itself, bringing with it new values and social structures that are fundamentally incompatible with the old Viking way of life. Christian kings discourage raiding against other Christians, and Christian merchants prefer peaceful trade to the mixture of commerce and piracy that characterized the Viking Age. The transformation is visible even in remote Greenland. Eric the Red was a pagan who honoured the old gods, Odin, Thor and Freya. But his son, Leif, who leads the expeditions to Vinland, converts to Christianity and brings priests to establish churches in the Greenland settlements. The change represents more than just a shift in religious belief. It signals the end of the cultural values that made the Viking expansion possible. As you reflect on your life, now as an old man in a Greenland farmstead, you realise that you have witnessed one of the most remarkable periods in human history. You began as a Norwegian farmer facing starvation on a small plot of marginal land. You became a raider who terrified monks and kings across northern Europe. You evolved into a settler who helped establish new kingdoms in England and Ireland. Finally, you became a pioneer who pushed the boundaries of human settlement to the very edge of the world. The Viking Age, you understand now, was never just about violence or adventure. It was about ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances with remarkable courage, adaptability and determination. The raids that made Vikings famous were just the beginning of a much larger story, the story of how a relatively small population of Scandinavian farmers and fishermen managed to reshape the political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. The Vikings established cities that still thrive today. Dublin, for example. They created trade routes that connected Europe with Asia and the Middle East. They developed sailing techniques and shipbuilding technologies that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, the Vikings created a cultural legacy that continues to inspire people nearly 1,000 years after the last longship was burned. The values they embodied, courage in the face of uncertainty, determination to seek new opportunities beyond the horizon, and the willingness to adapt to new challenges remain relevant in any age. The myths and legends that grew up around the Vikings often miss this deeper truth. The popular image of bloodthirsty berserkers in horned helmets, which, incidentally, they never wore, obscures the reality of a remarkably sophisticated and adaptable culture. The real Vikings were farmers and craftsmen, merchants and diplomats, explorers and administrators, who happened to live in an age when success often required the ability to fight, as well as the wisdom to know when fighting wasn't necessary. The end of the Viking Age came not through military defeat, but through cultural transformation. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia and the rest of Europe became more politically unified, the conditions that made Viking expansion possible gradually disappeared. The last great Viking expedition was Harald Hardrada's invasion of England in 1066, which ended with his death at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, just days before William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings. But the end of the Viking Age as a historical period did not mean the disappearance of Viking influence. The settlements they established became permanent features of the European landscape. The trade routes they pioneered continued to shape medieval commerce. The political institutions they developed influenced the growth of democracy and individual rights throughout northern Europe. In Iceland, the Althing, established by Viking settlers in 930 AD, is often called the world's oldest parliament. In England, the Danelaw region, settled by Vikings, maintained distinct legal and social traditions that influenced the development of English common law. In Russia, the state founded by Swedish Vikings became the foundation of the Russian Empire. The genetic legacy of the Vikings is equally impressive. Modern DNA studies show Viking influence throughout the areas they settled and traded. Significant percentages of the population in northern England, eastern Ireland, and western Scotland carry genetic markers that trace back to Scandinavian settlers. Even more remarkable, the same genetic markers appear in populations as far apart as Iceland and Ukraine, testimony to the extraordinary reach of Viking expansion. The technological legacy is equally significant. Viking shipbuilding techniques influenced naval architecture for centuries. Their methods of navigation, including the use of crystal sunstones to determine direction in cloudy conditions, represented cutting-edge technology for their time. Their metalworking skills, particularly in the production of swords and other weapons, set standards that weren't surpassed until the Renaissance. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Vikings is cultural. The stories they told and the values they embodied. The great sagas composed in medieval Iceland preserve not just historical information, but a worldview that emphasizes individual courage, personal honor, and the importance of reputation. These values, transmitted through literature and legend, continue to resonate in modern culture. The transformation of Vikings from historical reality to cultural myth began almost immediately after the end of the Viking Age. Medieval chroniclers, most of them Christian monks who had good reason to fear and hate Viking raiders, created images of Vikings as savage pagans sent by God to punish Christian sinners. These early accounts emphasized the violence and destructions of Viking raids while ignoring the sophisticated culture that produced them. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries created a different but equally distorted image: Vikings as noble savages living in harmony with nature, free from the corruptions of civilization. This romanticized vision influenced everything from Wagner's operas to the paintings of historical scenes that still shape popular perceptions of Viking culture. The 20th century added new layers to the Viking myth. The association of Vikings with Nordic racial theories during the Nazi period created dark political overtones that still complicate scholarly discussion of Viking culture. At the same time, popular culture embraced a comic book version of Vikings as larger-than-life heroes, complete with horned helmets, which real Vikings never wore, and magical powers which they certainly didn't possess. Modern scholarship has worked to separate historical reality from cultural myth, but the process is ongoing and often controversial. Archaeological discoveries continue to revise our understanding of Viking society, revealing a culture far more complex and sophisticated than either the savage raider or noble warrior stereotypes suggest. Recent archaeological evidence has revolutionized our understanding of Viking society in ways that make the old stereotypes seem almost laughable. Excavations at sites like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden reveal sophisticated urban centres with international connections reaching from Greenland to Constantinople. Viking merchants traded not just in the crude plunder of raids, but in luxury goods: Chinese silk, Arabian silver, Baltic amber, and Greenlandic walrus ivory. The famous Lewis chessmen, carved from walrus ivory in the 12th century, represent the artistic sophistication of Viking culture at its peak. These pieces, with their expressive faces and detailed clothing, demonstrate that Vikings were not just skilled warriors and sailors, but also accomplished artists and craftsmen. The intricate metalwork found in Viking graves, the sophisticated poetry preserved in Icelandic sagas, and the remarkable accuracy of their oral historical traditions all point to a culture that valued learning, artistic expression, and intellectual achievement. Perhaps most significantly, modern DNA analysis has revealed the true diversity of Viking society. The popular image of Vikings as uniformly tall, blonde, and blue-eyed is simply wrong. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking crews included people from across medieval Europe and beyond, Slavs from Eastern Europe, Celts from Ireland and Scotland, and even individuals whose genetic markers suggest origins in North Africa or Asia. This diversity reflects the fundamental character of Viking society as an open, meritocratic culture that valued ability over ancestry. Unlike the rigid class structures of medieval Europe, Viking society offered opportunities for social mobility that were remarkable for their time. A successful warrior could become a chieftain, a skilled craftsman could become wealthy, and even slaves could earn their freedom and rise to positions of respect. But the most important correction to popular mythology concerns the role of women in Viking society. The stereotype of Viking culture as hypermasculine, dominated by male warriors who treated women as property, is contradicted by substantial evidence of women's high status and active participation in all aspects of society. Viking women enjoyed legal rights that were extraordinary for medieval Europe. They could own property, request divorces, and serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. The archaeological record reveals women buried with weapons, suggesting they participated in warfare, and women buried with scales and weights, indicating their involvement in trade. The sagas tell stories of powerful female rulers like Queen Sigrid the Haughty, and formidable warriors like the legendary Shield Maidens. Most remarkably, genetic studies of Viking settlements show that women participated in the expansion and colonization process in significant numbers. The settlement of Iceland, for example, involved roughly equal numbers of men and women, contradicting the image of Viking expansion as purely male military conquest. These were family migrations, not just warrior expeditions. The famous female Viking warrior graves, once dismissed by scholars as anomalies or misinterpreted evidence, are now understood to represent a broader pattern of female participation in Viking military culture. While most warriors were certainly male, the evidence suggests that Viking society was far more inclusive and egalitarian than previously believed. As we reach the end of our journey through the real Viking Age, it's worth reflecting on why the myths and stereotypes have proven so persistent. Part of the answer lies in the dramatic nature of Viking expansion itself, the sheer audacity of a relatively small population of Scandinavian farmers managing to reshape medieval Europe through a combination of warfare, trade, and settlement is inherently compelling. The stories practically tell themselves, but the persistence of Viking mythology also reflects deeper needs in modern culture. The image of Vikings as fierce, independent warriors, living by their own rules, appeals to contemporary desires for freedom and authenticity. In an age of corporate hierarchies and bureaucratic institutions, the idea of the Viking as a free agent, answerable to no one but his crewmates and bound only by his own honour, has obvious psychological appeal. The problem is that this romanticised image obscures the more complex and ultimately more interesting historical reality. The real Vikings were not simple warriors, but sophisticated people who developed innovative solutions to the challenges of their time. Their ships were technological marvels, their social institutions were surprisingly democratic, and their expansion across medieval Europe represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Understanding the real Vikings also provides valuable perspective on our own time. Their ability to adapt to new environments, their willingness to embrace cultural diversity, and their talent for combining military prowess with commercial innovation offer lessons that remain relevant in the modern world. Perhaps most importantly, The Viking Age demonstrates the power of human agency in shaping historical change. The great migrations and conquests of the period were not the result of impersonal historical forces, but of thousands of individual decisions made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Young farmers like the one you became in our story chose to leave their homes, not because they were driven by some mysterious cultural imperative, but because they saw opportunities for a better life across the sea. The Viking Age reminds us that history is made not by abstract forces, but by real people making difficult choices under pressure. The Norse farmers who became raiders, the raiders who became settlers, and the settlers who became rulers were all responding to immediate, practical concerns: overpopulation, political instability, economic opportunity, and the simple human desire for security and prosperity. In this sense, the Vikings were not so different from people in any age who face limited opportunities at home and decide to seek their fortune elsewhere. What made them remarkable was not their supposed genetic disposition for violence or adventure, but their willingness to take extraordinary risks and their ability to adapt to radically new circumstances. The ships that carried them across unknown seas, the weapons that made them formidable in battle, and the social institutions that allowed them to govern themselves in alien lands were all products of human ingenuity applied to practical problems. The Viking Age was not a time of mystical warriors guided by ancient gods, but an era of remarkable innovation and achievement by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As you sit in your Greenland farmstead, watching the northern lights dance across the Arctic sky, you understand that your life has been part of something much larger than any individual story. You have participated in one of the great human migrations, comparable to the settlement of the Americas or the spread of agriculture across Europe thousands of years earlier. The journey that began with a young farmer facing starvation in Norway has ended with an old man watching his grandchildren play in the most remote European settlement in the world. Your personal transformation from farmer to raider to settler to pioneer mirrors the transformation of Viking society itself, from a collection of isolated Scandinavian tribes to a culture that influenced the development of medieval Europe, from Russia to Ireland, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea. The physical hardships, the constant dangers, the long separations from family and home, all of these were prices you paid for the opportunity to participate in something unprecedented in human history. You and your fellow Vikings pushed the boundaries of the known world further than anyone before you, establishing connections between distant lands that would endure long after the last longship had rotted away. But perhaps more importantly, you helped create a cultural legacy that transcends the specific achievements of conquest and exploration. The values that drove Viking expansion: courage in the face of uncertainty, adaptability to new challenges, respect for individual merit regardless of birth, and the belief that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, became part of the cultural inheritance of medieval Europe and, through it, the modern world. The morning sun is rising over Eriksfjord, painting the icebergs gold and silver. Your great-grandson runs to tell you that ships have been spotted on the horizon, the first supply ships from Iceland in 2 years. Tonight, there will be news from the wider world, stories of the old country, and perhaps word of your surviving relatives in Norway. But as you watch the ships grow larger against the morning sky, you realize that they represent both connection and isolation. The very fact that ships from Iceland are noteworthy events demonstrates how far you have travelled from your origins as a Norwegian farmer. You are now part of the furthest edge of human settlement, a witness to possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. Yet you are also connected through an invisible network of trade routes, kinship ties and shared culture to Vikings in Dublin and Kiev, in York and Novgorod, in Sicily and Constantinople. The same spirit of exploration and adaptation that brought you to Greenland has carried your people to the ends of the known world and beyond, creating a civilization that spans continents and connects cultures. As the ships draw closer to shore, you can see the familiar dragon heads carved on their prows, the distinctive sail patterns that mark them as vessels from the Viking world. Soon you will hear familiar voices speaking the language of your childhood, sharing news and stories from places you will never see again, but will never stop considering home. This is the final truth of the Viking Age. It was not just about conquest or exploration, but about the creation of connections between distant places and different peoples. The raids that terrorized medieval monasteries were also the beginning of trade networks that connected Europe with Asia. The warriors who conquered kingdoms also became farmers, merchants, and administrators who helped create the political and cultural foundations of the modern world. Tonight, as you share ale with the ship captains and listen to their stories of distant lands and great deeds, you will know that your life has been well lived. You chose the path of greatest risk and greatest reward, leaving the security of the familiar for the dangers and opportunities of the unknown. The journey has been longer and more extraordinary than you could have imagined when you first approached Jarl Erik with your father's old sword and your willingness to serve. You have seen the sun set over Ireland and rise over Greenland. You have stood in the halls of English kings and walked on shores that no human had ever seen before. You have participated in battles that changed the course of history and helped establish settlements that will endure for centuries. Most importantly, you have lived as a free man in an age when most people were bound by circumstances beyond their control. The Viking Age offered something that was rare in medieval Europe and remains precious in any age: the opportunity for ordinary people to write their own stories and shape their own destinies. The stories told around the fire tonight will become part of the great oral tradition that preserves the memory of the Viking Age. Some will be remembered in the sagas, others will fade with time, but all will contribute to the cultural legacy that makes the Vikings immortal, not as the savage warriors of popular imagination, but as the remarkable people they really were. As the northern lights begin to dance across the Arctic sky, you raise your horn of ale in a final toast to the journey that brought you here. The whale road that carried you from Norway to Greenland has become a bridge between past and future, connecting the world you were born into with the world your descendants will inherit. The Viking Age is ending, but its legacy will endure in the cities and trade routes, the laws and languages, the stories and values that Vikings helped create across medieval Europe. The longships will rot away, the weapons will rust, and the great halls will crumble, but the spirit of exploration and adaptation that defined your generation will continue to inspire future ages. Tomorrow, you will wake to another day in the most remote settlement in medieval Europe, tending livestock and preparing for the long Arctic winter. But tonight, as the aurora borealis paints the sky in impossible colours, you are still the Viking you became more than 30 years ago, a free man who chose to seek his fortune beyond the horizon and discovered wonders beyond imagination. Thank you for joining me on this voyage tonight. From the farms of Norway to the edge of the world in Greenland, we have travelled together through one of the most remarkable periods in human history, discovering that the real Vikings were far more complex and interesting than the myths suggest. I hope to see you soon on our next immersive adventure into the past. Until then, good night, and may you dream of dragon ships and distant shores.